think everybody is here, and I can run through attendance real quick. It looks like Mindy is here, John, Director Clark, Director Eichinger, Dana, Chairman Scripps, and Abby. Is there anybody on the call here that I missed for the task force members? Okay, and then from Eagle staff, it looks like we have Luke, and is there anybody else?
Amy's in, Amy Lowndes, and Dan Devon is in the lobby. Okay. I don't know if Mario Fusco was planning to call in on this one, but if he's there, please admit him as well.
Okay, yep, I'll do that right now. Okay, great. Thank you, Luke. Okay, so this session, just a little bit of housekeeping, is being recorded and is open to the public. The way that we've set this up is that panelists are able to see each other come up on the screens and talk. Members of the public are allowed to view the session. And I'm assuming the recordings will be available publicly after the fact. But it doesn't look like there are any members of the public in attendance. So I think it may just be the task force members. So we were able to send out the materials just the other day. A quick recap here of the agenda. We'll take a minute to review the purpose of the meeting today, which is relatively straightforward, just recapping the agenda. We plan on spending the majority of the time reviewing the recommendations from the ASDO and reviewing action items and next steps and just wrapping up from there. So this is a work session for the group. The purpose here, we want to highlight that we recognize that the last session was too short. It was just too much ground to cover in roughly 30 minutes for actual conversation. So we heard from the members, we heard from the panelists, and decided to change the approach that we're taking, recognizing that feedback, and give the group more time over 2 sessions, 90 minutes each, to really go through these recommendations in greater detail. So we're hoping that we'll be able to have good conversation here today. The Eagle staff also took it upon themselves to reformat the ASDO recommendations into the materials provided yesterday over email. And so we'll probably use the spreadsheet as the basis of the conversation today. And within that, we did 2 things. So one, we'll see the the Eagle staff identified some of the recommendations that seem to be relatively straightforward that I don't believe we'll need a great deal of discussion on. And then in addition to that, I went ahead and added some of the notes that we captured to reflect the conversation from our previous meeting. So I'm hoping that we can use that to dive in and just get into the conversation on the recommendations. So before we do that, are there any questions or comments here on what we're trying to do today, or the process here that we'll use?
So John, do you also have the spreadsheet that we put together that has the background information? Because I think that'll be helpful for the group.
Yeah, I believe my understanding is it's one and the same here, and I'll go ahead and share my screen even, as that may be helpful here. Okay, are folks able to see my spreadsheet screen here?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so within that spreadsheet, the Eagle staff also added some additional information here with background materials and their estimations here and the staffing and the resource needs to be able to implement each of these recommendations. So I think we'd like to focus the conversation on the recommendations first, and then as needed or if necessary, talk about the staffing and the resource capacity. So anything else here before we dive in? Is everybody comfortable with where we're at?
Yeah, all good on my end, John.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's dive in here with the compliance and enforcement recommendations. And I believe we left off here with recommendation 14B regarding the development of a priority list. The task force in our last conversation pointed out that it may not be worthwhile or best to assign an arbitrary number of dams that should be on the list, a top 10 or a top 20, but some members at least felt that it might be beneficial to use a risk-based criteria to identify those dams that are on the highest priority list. So it seemed like that made a lot of sense to folks on our quick session last week, but we'd like to continue talking that one through.
So I've seen a variety of these systems used, and really what you want a category where the owner operator is acceptable. You know, you're just in a monitoring phase, no additional oversight or concern is warranted. And then you start to head in a negative direction. And usually there's a, you know, if you want to use red, yellow, green, you know, we can settle out of whatever we want. But then some kind of detrimental action gets you in a deteriorating column, if you will. So you're kind of on a watch list. I've seen that used as well, you know, where your performance isn't where prompt action is required, but your performance or your rating is deteriorating. And so you're kind of on a watch list, and maybe it requires a little bit more frequent inspection, or there's outstanding actions that are pending. And then you have the list of let's say red, where immediate action or intervention is required, and those that, you know, represent some risk to the public. I've seen that even divided into several additional categories of, you know, the point of shutting your operation down, or the state or the feds intervening. You know, you're definitely in a category where you're not meeting your unacceptable performance, and you are going to have many new friends who are going to help you get out of that category. So the simplest has been kind of that 3-phase, so that it's not a surprise when you end up in the red category, that you had some warning or indication. And I don't know how the state has used that in other areas of regulatory oversight, where, you know, the majority of people are usually in the green column. You'll have some small subset that are yellow. Hopefully they're working to get themselves back into green. And then you have those that are in immediate risk or require immediate action or increased oversight, you know, right now or on an ongoing basis until they get themselves out of trouble.
This is Luke. I would just say that, you know, kind of the current system is very similar to what you described. We typically rank prioritization by hazard potential, you know, what the downstream hazard is if a dam were to be in bad shape, you know, and then also there's a condition assessment assigned to every dam, and those are satisfactory, fair, poor, and unsatisfactory. So it's maybe like a red, yellow, or like a green, yellow, orange, red type of thing, where unsatisfactory is that immediate action, poor is kind of the now I need to do something but not as urgent, and then fair and satisfactory is where we want people to be. You know, that's the, you know, everything's great, or maybe there's a few things we need to keep an eye on, but otherwise everything's great. So I don't know if that's the key, you know, or that's what we should, you know, base this prioritization on, but that's the system we have in place right now, and that's typically how we've looked at it for a top to bottom prioritization, is kind of a combination of condition and hazard, lump them together and rank them out that way.
That's what I thought, Luke. Was this comment or recommendation from DSASO, DASDO? I always get it. It doesn't roll off my tongue. That we are not focusing, or we don't have a sophisticated enough methodology for the orange-red category that you were talking about, which relates to the whole escalation issue. Is that what? I don't remember the exact issue they were presenting to us.
So I've always been accustomed to calling them ASDSO, but they call themselves ASDO. So if that rolls off your tongue, ASDO, that's a very acceptable variation. So I think this was kind of the bigger picture of, you know, they used some pretty strong language in the report, right? Of Michigan has this culture of limited enforcement, or, you know, and I think that's a resultant of a lot of things. And so this was a way for us to focus in the resources that we have, whether that's 2 engineers or 10 engineers, to prioritize and go after these in a way that's it's a meaningful, you know what I mean? Don't just throw darts at a dartboard and, you know, randomly enforce. I think so. I think that's the context is, if we're not doing such a great job now, here's one tool that can be utilized to hone down the list so that we can focus efforts.
So to summarize here, does it make sense then where the highest risk dams would be those with the highest hazard potential and also the worst condition assessments? Or are there others then that might be a lower risk from the hazard side that would also elevate? Is it really just the intersection of the worst condition dams that have the highest risk that would be on that short list? Or there are others that would also be worth considering?
There's some other things we can look at, you know, like population at risk, you know, is a good measure of what that, you know, the high highs and the low highs, you know, of, you know, maybe there's 10 people at risk or 10,000 people at risk. And obviously the one that has 10,000 deserves more resources. But I really key in on, personally, I key in on the condition assessment. As you know, if it's a low hazard dam in unsatisfactory condition, that needs action right away or it's going to fail. Or if it's a high hazard dam that's unsatisfactory condition, it needs action right away or it could fail. So you know, that's kind of and then obviously if I have to pick one or the other, it's the high above the, you know, the low. But like I said, there's obviously other factors that we have to consider, which is population at risk, reaction time, things like that, you know, complexity and cost, you know, if it's something that we can address overnight by lowering the lake level, or if it's something that requires millions of dollars and efforts to go after, you know, that plays into decision making as well.
That's helpful. Thoughts from others?
This is Mario Fusco. Just to complement what Luke said, also the age of the structure and the type of structure. Just recently, I went to a webinar by the American Society of Civil Engineering that they did their investigation of Edenville failure, and the type of the construction or the engineers that construct that dam, they believe there are many more dams just like the one that pose some kind of risk. So, and unfortunately, most of the dams, old dams, we don't have the plans how they were constructed. But that's a good indication if it was constructed by or was engineered by the same engineers, we may have the same risk as Edenville.
Is that reflected in the condition assessments?
Not really.
Okay.
It should be though.
Well, it sounds like here that there's a sense here that it should be more risk-based based on some of the topics and items that we've defined. I don't know that we need to spend this group's time hashing out those specific criteria, but I think we could craft a recommendation that would say develop risk-based criteria considering these elements and continue to advance that, if that sounds like a good solution here for everybody.
Yeah, part of our point was to not limit it to 10 or 20. You know, if you're a red dam, if you're in the unacceptable category, then there's no limit to that number. It was part of our discussion in the past. And then I think to Luke's point, maybe what we're saying is whoever is red, let's prioritize from 1 to whatever, so we know what's the most significant and highest risk down to the least significant unacceptable dam. But if you're red, you're red. And we need to be addressing all dams that end up in an unacceptable category.
That's fair. Okay. Any final discussion on this recommendation? Okay, great. Well, moving on, 14C is one that Eagle staff identified as being relatively straightforward. It's meeting on a periodic basis among the relevant parties to review actions and activities related to dam management on that priority list. So I want to pause to just make sure that everyone is comfortable with that recommendation as is. If so, we'll keep moving here. Okay. Well, hearing none, then moving on to 14D, the development of a written policy for a standardized pathway for progressive enforcement actions. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about this at our previous meeting, but members identified that this was one that the group felt warranted more discussion. So I think we'd like to just open it up and get some feedback.
So this is Luke. I can
Hey,
start.
this is,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Luke, it's Liesel. This is Liesel. I wanted to step in here before we go too far from a dam safety perspective and make sure that everyone understands that Eagle's in the process of doing an enforcement review overall for our enforcement strategy and policy across the department. So this has been ongoing for the last couple of months, and the Eagle team has been looking at each of the different divisions and how they approach enforcement review, and then working to build a consistent framework at department-wide level that then gets implemented from the division level. So this specific conversation is really important, but I also wanted to have the framework of understanding that more general process is in play at the same time. So anyway, just wanted to give everybody that context. Back to Luke.
No, that's perfect. You actually almost said exactly what I was going to say, was that that was kind of the recommendation or the discussion about when we talked to ASDSO about this, was that we kind of have general like division and department enforcement strategies, and their recommendation was that we put dam specific, enforcement strategy into that larger plan, of, so that it mentions, what are that pathway to that progressive enforcement strategy, where we don't just let things hang out on the line for too long. We are progressing towards an end where and these things don't slip through the cracks. So I think that dovetails very well into what Liesl just said, was that we're looking at this department wide, and maybe we should, while we're doing that, we just kind of develop some specific language for dams to meet that goal and to fit very well into that overall plan.
So it sounds like this is more or less underway already, and just making sure that there's a component of it specific to dams.
In
John,
that
go ahead.
situation, with the insight from Director Clark and Luke, I would just say we would pass this one on as it's written. The state's already taken action to go after this. And
Yeah, and I didn't say any of that to suggest the recommendation isn't important and can't be recommended by this group. I just wanted to give you all context for where we're at as a starting point.
Okay. Does that sound good to everybody? Seeing heads nod here. Okay.
I think it sounds good.
I'm sorry, Mindy, could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you real well.
I said it sounds good to me.
Okay, great. Yeah, you'll notice here, I may take a couple longer pauses here as we do this through Zoom, just to make sure that everyone's had the opportunity to unmute themselves and get that opportunity to speak. So moving along then, 14E, again, one that Eagle staff identified as being relatively straightforward. We'll take a moment to pause to see if anybody wants to elevate this for further discussion. And if not, then we'll keep moving. Okay, well, hearing none then, we'll keep moving on to recommendation 14G. Again, this is one that we didn't get a great deal of time to talk through during our last meeting, but task force members, again, identified it as one that they would like to discuss. And that's regarding the creation and implementation of a Dam Safety 101 enforcement training. So we'll open it up for discussion and feedback from task force members.
Well, I can just give you insights for how this works at the Ferc level. As part of the owner's dam safety program that we are required to implement as a Ferc licensee, we are required to give annual training for anyone that has a role in that program, up through me and even my bosses, so that people are aware of the existence of the program, you know, that there can be enforcement, and it's just an annual requirement. I think that's very similar in some ways to what they're specifying here, although I don't exactly remember who they felt was in the required training population list.
I think that the recommendation came as for, we have a separate compliance and enforcement unit in water that typically handle our escalated enforcement action at dams. And there might be turnover, or there might not be dedicated staff to dams. So I think that was, but also we work with the Department of Attorney General every time we have to take court action against a dam owner or whatever. So, and those folks, there's turnover and not dedicated staff. So I think it was kind of this idea of periodically we all get together and we kind of outline what the roles and responsibilities are, and or even if it's cross training, maybe they need to go out in the field and inspect a dam with us, you know what I mean, just so that they see. And so I think it's kind of open for interpretation by this group, but I think that was kind of the thought process they were following, is you should know these people, you should be able to pick up the phone and call them, they should have a general idea of what you do day to day, and that way they can help you when it comes time to take that enforcement action as needed.
I think it's a fine recommendation. Usually I see these as within 30 days, 90 days of assuming a role within the targeted population, and then annually thereafter. I don't have any reservations about it.
Just taking a few notes here. Are there any other clarifications that the subgroup here would like to recommend to make this a little bit clearer about what the recommendation is? Some of those other groups to coordinate with, the frequency. John, you mentioned 30 or 90 days.
Yeah, define the targeted population, and then align on, obviously, when you take a role, if it's mid-cycle, you would probably want to get exposed to this, and then annually reinforcing it. So it's just the practicality of implementing any kind of a awareness type training program. I would just model after anything else the state does in this area.
Does that all sound good to everybody else?
No concerns here.
Dana, so
Sounds good.
take yourself off mute.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Keep rolling right along here then. 14H, again, one that the Eagle staff identified as being relatively straightforward, using revenue from fines to fund the Dam Safety Emergency Fund. Again, we'll pause, see if anyone wants to elevate this recommendation for greater discussion.
I'm sorry, where does the money go now?
Luke, are you able to help us out with that one?
Maybe Amy knows, or Director Clark probably knows a little better than I do, but I think it goes into some like general fund where all the penalties go to. It doesn't go, you know, to this specific emergency fund because one, that fund doesn't exist. I don't think that's how we handle fines. So somebody else is more knowledgeable.
Yeah, Luke's correct. That's we all fines go back to the general fund. It's a kind of a structural principle of the department that fine penalties should not fund our work. So that's correct. It goes back to the general fund.
So do you disagree with this then? I mean, this is a deviation from your general principle.
No, it doesn't go to our general fund. It goes to the broad general fund. So it's not like it goes back.
The idea that penalties shouldn't fund your work. Do you have an issue with the recommendation?
Yes, if it shifts that general principle, it would be something that we're not comfortable with. Again, that's just kind of good environmental policy to make sure that your penalties aren't funding the department.
I think to agree with what the director is saying, what this does is not provide money for staffing. What ASDSO is recommending here is that the penalties and fines go into the Dam Safety Emergency Fund. And in the report and in some of the other subgroups, one of the recommendations is to set up a Dam Safety Emergency Fund so that when emergency repairs are not done by the dam owner and the department has to step in, that there is an emergency fund for us to use to get that work done quickly. Because right now we spend a lot of time trying to figure out where the money is going to come from for emergency work when we have to do it.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, Amy. I'm not looking at it, but as long as it's not going to fund our direct work, but emergency type structure would be fine.
There was a consensus among that other group that was looking at the issue of how to set up that fund and how to fund it, that likely fines and permit fees, if they could be redirected to that fund, would not likely be enough to keep it funded and replenish it if we have to take large scale action. You know, it might do some of the smaller actions that we might be able to take, but you know, so I think this was as a broader funding strategy that might be some type of appropriation or whatever from the general fund to set it up, and then this could be ways to maybe replenish it if that's the appropriate structure to follow. You know, whether fines and fees are appropriate to go into this emergency fund.
So it sounds like
I don't know which group is looking at all the finance stuff, but that is like we're going to have to be synced up when it comes to these recommendations.
And I had already written down that I wanted to talk to PSC about, there's several different groups that touched this emergency fund. So I think when we all come back together, that is going to be one of the things we have to coalesce around the same concept. We just had a meeting of the program management subgroup, and they spent quite a bit of time talking about financing. So I feel like they are probably going to come out with some things that everybody can talk about. But this issue of penalties and fines was not specifically brought up in that other group. So you still probably want to at least conceptually think about it.
Yeah, appreciate you flagging that, Amy. I wasn't a part of that conversation, so that's certainly helpful for me, and I can help coordinate among the different subgroups here. Our understanding here is that in terms of process, the work groups will be reporting back out to the broader committee, and that'll be one opportunity to kind of talk through different perspectives on different elements. But it sounds like go ahead.
Sorry, John.
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
So there's another work group that will recommend the creation of a dam safety emergency fund. And it is the work of this group that would say that one of the ways to sort of continue to make sure there's funding is that any fines for violations then flow into that fund.
Yeah,
Or do we need to
that's
recommend
right.
its creation as well?
No, I think you're right. But I think the bigger task force will have to talk about it, as
Okay.
John was saying.
Yeah, so there
I also
is-
wouldn't want it to get to a point where either the fines are too small or in other ways insufficient, and the legislature can say, well, we've got a funding source that's committed to this. Like, if we're going to have a dam safety emergency fund, it's got to have adequate resources. And if these resources are adequate, that's great. But I think whatever task force or whatever group recommends the creation of the funds, that, making sure that it has what it needs to do the job. And this can be part of it, but I don't know that this should be all of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there is a funding work group that's focusing specifically on the funding aspect, but funding certainly underpins all other activities. And so it'll need to be, I think, discussed a little bit more holistically and in tandem with all the other recommendations here. So I think for the purpose of this recommendation, if there's general consensus among the group that the money collected through fines should go into that fund, with the limitations that it not be directed to support staff resources, but only emergency action at dams. We can keep moving forward here and flag it also that there needs to be the broader discussion around the purpose of the emergency fund to make sure that all the subgroups are kind of pulling in the same direction.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the recommendations on the compliance and enforcement. I think what we'd like to do here is keep on rolling through the ASDO recommendations for emergency management. And then whether it's today or on our next meeting, we will also take some time to see if there are other recommendations that task force members want to bring forth within either of these categories. So if the group is comfortable with it here, we can keep rolling through on the emergency action.
The only recommendation that I have, I really like the layout of the spreadsheet, but the only thing that I'm kind of struggling with is whenever we do like an after action review or an improvement plan, we always assign or identify who the agency or department or individual is that we're making the recommendation to, that we want them to be in charge of accomplishing that action. So the only thing I'm seeing here with these recommendations is some of them, I'm not sure if it's just the division, if it's the department, if it's the agency as a whole as Eagle, partner agency that is needing to be responsible for accomplishing that recommendation. So going back to the one that Liesl had talked about earlier about the development or adoption of a written policy for violation management, that's being done basically by the agency as a whole, but then needs to be modified by the dam safety division. So I would just maybe recommend that we might want to add potentially a column of who are we assigning these recommendations to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point and can certainly be helpful with tracking the recommendations. I might ask other staff. Go ahead, Director.
No, I definitely agree with that. I also think that we're going to end up with recommendations, some that live at the department and some that live at the legislature and, maybe other places. And so defining that role is important. So I like that.
So one of the things that we did in the spreadsheet, and it's kind of, at least on my screen, it's a little bit off of the thing, is we were kind of assuming that most of the administrative things, were assigned to the department, but we did identify in this column legislative or rule change. We identified whether there would need to be work either through a legislative process or a rule change. And then I'm not sure if there's any like this in this subgroup, but there are some that would have taken like civil service commission action or some other things. So in our spreadsheet, we've basically identified if there's no legislative or rule change, we think it's something the department can probably implement.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for clarifying that, Amy.
Yep.
And we may be able to make it a little bit more clear in the document as well, whether it's a department-wide or agency or the legislature too. We might look to the Eagle staff here to help us out with that. And I don't know that we need to take up the work group's time with running through all of those.
I think we can take a crack at who would presumably take a lead on this action once it's adopted. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, turning then to emergency management. We didn't, again, have a whole lot of time to talk about these at our previous meeting. What I had in my notes here is that the members wanted to have a little bit more holistic discussion around emergency action plans. And so I think I'll just ask the group what your pleasure is here. Do you want to walk through these recommendation by recommendation or have that more holistic discussion?
Well, let's start holistic is my recommendation. So emergency planning is not, relegated to just the, no pun intended, the dam world. And any of these have to be coordinated with other emergency management organizations. So I get that when you're looking at dams, it's a unique beast and animal, but Abby will testify that there's tremendous amounts of coordination. And this is just one category of emergencies that, every entity needs to be able to deal with. There's some unique aspects, but I holistically, I need to understand, I would need to understand, is there really benefit here for mandating additional requirements on dam owners that's not already picked up on by the overall topic of emergency planning?
So I'm going to jump in here and just throw out my 2 cents when it comes to this, because this is something that I've always kind of personally struggled with just a little bit. So when it comes to, let's say, the Ferc dams, for example, even the state of Michigan dams, when we're dealing with requirements of an emergency plan, that requirement is what actions is that dam owner or operator going to take during an emergency situation? What conditions require them to communicate out to the community or to emergency responders to then take action? So the responsibility of the dam owner operator starts and stops basically with that dam. Everything else for emergency notification, emergency evacuations, sheltering, all of those response aspects when it comes to that emergency scene fall to the community. And there is no requirement anywhere for us as emergency managers to make sure that we have an emergency response plan for our portion of that response. And so to me, that's always been something that's been a disconnect. I take it very seriously because I view that we have a very large hazard in our community. And I want to make sure that we all realize as a community and as a community of emergency responders, where would we go? What will we do? Because we don't have time to discuss it if we get that notification that the dam is failing. And so I think when it comes to the emergency planning world, that's always been a huge disconnect, is there's no emphasis to the emergency management partners within that community. You're required to have a response plan. So for hazardous material sites, for example, underneath community right to know, we are required, and there is a planning grant that we have through the Community Right to Know program to help make sure that we have response plans for these hazardous materials sites. And so if something occurs at that site or that facility, we know the population that's impacted, We know our emergency evacuation routes. We know how we're going to communicate out to this area. There's nothing like that when it comes to dams and high risk, high hazard dams. So I don't know when ASDSO made that recommendation, if that's what they were leaning towards. But at the same time, whenever we exercise our emergency plan within our community, it's always a partnership with the dam owner operator and our community. But we've never had state participation ever since I've been here. The state has never participated in an exercise. When we ask them, what would be your role? What would you do? They can't answer except for, well, we'll supply whatever resources you tell us you need. And to me, that's not good enough. There's a huge gap there. My 2 cents, my soapbox, thank you.
I appreciate that perspective, Abby. So I'm curious, how much variation then is there among local plans when it comes to emergency response? Do local leaders generally embrace it well and put together, well-designed response plans, or is there variation? Is there opportunity to reduce the burden on local partners by providing guidelines and best practices, or do local priorities kind of win the day there? Are there circumstances that are just different enough that it makes sense to have some variation locally?
So I think it does make sense to have some variation locally, but there are no overarching guidelines or recommendations or best practices or plan template of these are the points of consideration. These are the things during a dam failure you need to watch for. This is who you need to communicate with. When I developed our community's plan, I did it from scratch, and every flood, every event, we're reviewing that to make sure that what we have on paper is something that we can actually carry out in our community. My partners across the state, I can't speak for them because every community is different. I can only speak to Midland County. I shared our dam plan with Midland County a couple years ago, and what they had in place, majority of it was what I gave them for the initial operation. Beyond that, they didn't have anything else. We still are working on it. So yeah, there's very little guidance out there when it comes to a major dam emergency or a high risk, high hazard event.
So it seems like there's a huge difference.
Dan, I'm not able to hear you at least.
Just hear me?
Yeah, you're back.
Seems like there's a major difference between the large high consequence, high impact dams and some of the smaller dams. So it may be, as we're thinking about what size dam triggers or what sort of potential impact dam, it may be that you want to require it for high impact dams and maybe not for all of them. Maybe you do want to require it for every dam, that every community has a dam related emergency response plan, but that different elements should be included based on the level of consequence or impact. And then Abby, I guess I'm interested, when you say that you don't get participation from the state, is it that you don't get participation from the Eagle Dam Safety Group, or is it from sort of Department of State Police or the sort of emergency preparedness folks, or both?
So when it comes to participation, it's kind of been both over the years. We've had, whenever we do our full scale exercises or even our tabletops every 5 years, we're required to, because we have a Ferc dam. We have Ferc representation basically on site during that exercise, but we don't have any communication with the State Emergency Operations Center. I built a great partnership with our local dam safety staff, Luke and Dan. We've had a very good relationship so far, but it's because we've had issues, and so through experience, I know when to call them and I know when to say, hey, I need help. Last year, I had an issue with one of my low hazard dams, and I noticed, because of my experience, something wasn't right, because the dam owner operator called me and said, we need help. When I went out to go assess it, there was a flag, and I'm like, oh, this is not good. And so based on my knowledge and my experience, I called for help to the dam safety division and said, hey, this is what I'm seeing, red flag. And immediately they ended up coming on boots on the ground because it was an emergent issue. Had I not had that relationship or their knowledge, there was nothing to flag me as an emergency manager that these conditions need to be reported up to this official or these partners. So I think it's kind of both a response issue, a planning issue, as well as a training and exercise issue, which is the umbrella of, you know, emergency management. There's a disconnect that I think needs to be fixed.
Okay. Dan, are you trying to add in there, Chairman Scripps? Okay.
I was going to jump in.
I just said that makes sense.
Okay.
I was going to say a couple things. You know, the Ferc requirements for emergency action planning, exercise, and format are much more well-defined than the state. The state has general requirements about what an emergency action plan for a dam must be, and then there's a kind of a general, or must contain, and there's a general rule that says that the plan has to be reviewed by county emergency management staff to make sure that it complies with the county emergency response plan. And Abby's right, you know, different counties do it different way, different dam owners do it different ways. And some of those plans are very effective and some of them are very ineffective. And, you know, and so I think that standardization is one of the recommendations, and one of the other groups, I think, of the state requiring a standard EAP format, which I think is a good idea. And there's best practices from our federal partners on how to do that. And I also think that another recommendation, I think maybe in the legislation and authority group, is that we require exercising of the EAPs at the state level, because we don't have that requirement. The only exercise that we would attend would be for FERC regulated dams when we're invited and have time to come, that are not under our purview. So we come there as a, you know, basically as a, you know, a resource from the state that has dam safety expertise, but no regulatory authority as time permits. So I think that's, you know, one distinction is, in my experience, we've done a few state dam EAP exercise, and those have been very beneficial. And the FERC ones are very beneficial because the folks who would actually be responding to the emergency sit down and look at the plan, and they say, if I had to throw this on the hood of my truck at, you know, 6 p.m. on Saturday, July 4th, I know what to do. And oftentimes the answer is no, I don't know what to do, you know, because it doesn't have those evacuation routes and road closures and stuff very well mapped out, or roles and responsibilities so defined that when they get that call that, hey, XYZ dam is failing, they don't know what to do without a lot of coordination. So I think that's, you know, that's what we're striving for, is a better way for a plan to define the roles of the dam owner, where their roles and responsibilities stop, where the local dispatch and emergency management folks, you know, pick up their authority, and then the plan contains all the technical information that those folks would need to understand what roads are getting closed, what houses are getting evacuated, when, you know, when they need shared resources, et cetera, and the notification and things like that. So I think that's very, very good, you know, and I think that I would say keep in mind those other recommendations are to develop a standardized format and to require that state dams exercise their EAPs on some schedule. And I think that that would all lead up to general improvement of the plan quality and the ability to enact that plan by emergency personnel should a dam emergency arise. So.
And this is Lisa, of course, with my budget role, I'm going to have to point out that a lot of these steps are important and will lead to better insurance of public safety and require time and resources in order to do. So just got to say it once in a while, every meeting. So
appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things, you know, from an emergency management perspective that would be really nice to have included, and this might be something that should be considered for legislation, is what conditions are required to be reported and to whom by law. So there's consequences if they're not reporting an emergency condition, and it specifies who they need to report it to and in what time frame. Again, I kind of go back to using the same example as our hazardous materials sites. That is a requirement by law for our hazardous materials sites, and our 302, which is our extremely hazardous substance sites. They have a requirement if they have a leak of, you know, X amount of their, or any type of leak, they're required within a certain time frame to be able to report to the local community. They're given the numbers that they need to report to, and State Eagle, and they're given the numbers that they have to report to. There's nothing like that for dam safety that I'm aware of.
So it sounds like, I'm sorry, John, can you hear me? I'm just gonna check.
I can hear you.
Excellent. I mean, it sounds like there's a couple things here that all sort of go to both, you know, some programs that Eagle may be able to do on their own, but likely, you know, a pretty significant set of recommendations to the legislature, including requirements on what local communities need to have in terms of a dam emergency response plan, maybe some detail that differentiates between types of dams, including sort of the regularity of training exercises relating to the plans. I mean, Abby could, I think, probably just write down a whole list of things that should be in this, but including sort of what sort of the level of engagement from the SEOC or from others in terms of working with the communities on these things, that, you know, what you were just talking about in terms of the sort of the specifics that sort of have to be included in the frameworks. It seems like there's a lot here under sort of emergency response and emergency management that could go to the legislature for sort of a piece. And I would hope that as part of that, and it'll probably come up, there are going to be other pieces from others, including the thing that we were talking about around the emergency response fund or whatever it is. But it seems like there's a fair amount here that may go beyond what the agency can do, sort of acting on its own.
Yeah, I think you just summarized it very well there, Chairman. So, I mean, it sounds like that's the direction here this group would like to go in terms of the recommendation, and maybe tying it back to the ASDO recommendations. It seems like 15A is more or less in that line, that these requirements should be put into place and that some resources should be provided to communities to develop these plans in terms of best practices and supporting materials. So clarify what the requirements are and help provide resources to assist communities in the development of those plans. Is that a fair summary then?
Yeah, and then also just to make sure, yeah, what is an emergency response, like, and contact, or what do you do if you have an emergency? Like, who do you contact? Yeah.
The execution there.
Yeah.
So I'll add this one to the same. And one thing that was unclear to me in reading this recommendation is what the hazard risk here is. So are we talking, you know, about all dams? Are we talking about high hazard dams? Are we talking about high hazard dams in a poor condition, fair condition? I'm not sure all the classes offhand. Does this group want to put any more bounds around this recommendation to clarify the intent?
I think all dams should do it, because I mean, even if you have a failure, you have a failure. could still wash out a road and people's houses or something, you know?
So currently under statute and rule, only high and significant hazard potential dams are required to have emergency action plans. And when they're given the hazard potential classification, that kind of takes into account the downstream impacts, whether roads would be washed out. So, and I would say if you need a little background, maybe we can provide the links to the hazard potential definitions, but it's kind of loosely laid out in there, like what things are low hazard, don't require an emergency action plan, what are significant and high, and what do. And obviously loss of life, economic and environmental impact, impacts to roads and railroads and things like that will elevate it to certain levels. So, but that's kind of the threshold now. So if you're talking about going into the arena where we would require emergency action plans for all dams, including low hazard dams, I think that's probably a little inconsistent with other states, other federal agencies, you know, the practice, but it would be a significant increase over what we're currently doing and require, you know, a change in statute and rule. So I think that just for a little bit of background.
Yeah, thank you, Luke.
So I'm still struggling a bit. I don't like the inclusion of the last sentence there in this recommendation, because we're referring again back to this dam safety emergency fund that doesn't exist. And you know, when you implement the emergency plan, you want to protect life and property to the extent you can, evacuate people out, make sure there's good coordination, and to throw this in there, like, you know, the kitchen sink, to say, well, let's go get some money from the emergency fund. I think it's a little bit out of context. So I don't agree with including that in this recommendation. I'm still struggling with the practicality of, in theory, I agree with all this stuff. But, you know, as someone from an organization that takes emergency planning very seriously, has dedicated resources to it, wants to coordinate very well with everyone, all the stakeholders involved in that, I still get back to, how do we make this actually happen? If you have a dam owner that's like one person that lives in Florida, and they don't even have an organization that, you know, owns and operates that dam, they're not going to do any of this stuff. They have no resources. You know, I almost think, so even if you put this requirement in place, then you need to identify where does it not exist, and then how do you enforce or motivate people to get an effective emergency response plan in place, and then who's going to do that work? Who's going to do the work on evacuation routes? And I'm really struggling without a clear understanding of the capabilities of the owners to know who to assign this work to. Abby's extremely conscientious. She does a great job, and she's got some resources at her disposal, and she could probably flag that I've got an owner that isn't cooperating or isn't doing their part. So that'll give us a flag, but then I still don't necessarily see a resolution path to get someone who has resources that they're both willing and able to commit to even get a good written plan in place, let alone make sure it's valid, it's updated, it's exercised. Someone's going to show up at the after action debrief and then agree to take actions to cover gaps. I'm struggling with the framework, pointing back to dam, you know, the requirements of dam ownership, which are pretty, what allows you to own a dam, and what financial resources do you need to have available to you to have this ownership and responsibility of a dam that represents a hazard to the community. I think a lot of things point back to that, which is very difficult to solve now, because we may determine that a significant number of existing dam owners do not have the resources to meet all of their obligations under what we're envisioning as an enhanced dam safety program. So I'm more inclined to point to the emergency response organizations like Abby's in the various locales to engage with them to identify where the gaps exist, but then I don't know what to do after that. Let's say we know that in these counties, for a variety of reasons, we've got high hazard dams that don't have an adequate emergency response plan. Then what do we do? If we've got an owner that doesn't have the resources to uphold their obligation, I'm thinking through the practicality, and I'm struggling. So I agree it's necessary, but I'm not sure that just, agreeing that it's necessary is going to get us to where we'd like to be.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. And there's a lot to unpack in what you just shared there. So, and I have some background in dams and dam management, but certainly not as much as everybody else on the work group here. So when I read this recommendation, I interpreted it as being geared towards county, and local emergency managers, and maybe I'm mistaken in that. John, when you started airing those concerns, the first question I had was, well, wouldn't the community still want those even if there is an absentee dam owner? It seems like the natural answer to that is yes.
Well, until it costs money, though. Until it costs money to do something.
Yeah, because it'd be easier, like the hazardous waste plans and stuff that companies are required to keep, or counties or cities or whatever. A lot of them, they have to keep them or they can shut down the company. But how do you shut down a dam? You can't really just, I guess.
So
it's an individual owner. But then I know there was another group that was talking about dam owners should have, to own a dam, they should have so much in a backup fund for emergencies, a contingency fund. But I don't know how you're going to require somebody that already owns a dam that may have inherited it from like 10 people down to have a backup contingency fund, or who takes the ownership of the dam if they don't?
So Luke, this is Dan Devon. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall when we were having the discussions with ASDSO during the peer review process, I was under the impression that this, while it extends beyond the dam safety program, it really was just kind of setting up this overarching emergency response plan, such that, part of the thing that we had even said was, even in terms of our role in showing up on site for an emergency can be convoluted in terms of what we can do. And then, they throw in, they tag on this sentence about the emergency fund. Part of it is we show up on site, and even if we see problems, we don't readily have funds available to even do anything. It's wholly dependent upon the owner stepping up and taking action. And so, this basically I think the intent is that this sets up a plan, a process, so that when we show up, we know what our authorities are, in the limits of what we can do. The owner and the emergency managers should know that as well. And then ideally, if we have an emergency fund, it provides us a path and probably a series of steps that allows us to get to that.
Sure, and Dan, I would echo that. I was actually going to say pretty close to the same thing. As I guess when we were discussing, we kind of transitioned from the holistic view of EAPs to this 2020-15A. And 2020-15A, if you reread it, is, I believe what Dan said, it's a plan for the department and the state to define roles of the dam safety program during an emergency, the state police and the SEOC, and the Eagle emergency management coordinator and the county emergency management coordinators and the local personnel. These are where the responsibilities lie when we come out to site and there's a dam emergency. It's either failing or it might not fail, but like who makes the calls, who does what? Because I don't think that's very well defined. Typically we try to follow the incident command structure, which means that somebody's going to set up, incident command, and there'll be, we'll have some role in that system, but we don't, like Dan said, we don't own the dam. We don't have the authority to touch the dam typically, unless we've issued an emergency order or something like that. So we're reliant on the dam owner and their consultants to try to get all the right information, take any necessary actions to save the dam if possible. But if not, then they enact the emergency action plan, which should have all the steps pretty well defined. And that's, I think we kind of crossed two bridges there, where what do we need to do, and so that people know what our role is when we come out to site, and that everybody's role is well defined ahead of an emergency. But then in the emergency, is the plan adequate so that folks know what they're doing ahead of time as well? So I think, yeah, I think that some of these next bullets kind of get into the actual emergency action plan put together by the owner and how that ties back into the county emergency response plan, because there is some transfer of, you know, the dam owner's responsibilities go to a certain point and then the county takes over, you know, and the state and everybody brings resources to the county and, you know, through that incident command structure and all that stuff. So I think that's what I think this one is getting to, is let's define the roles in a kind of a generic state emergency response plan, so that we know how it ties into each individual dam's emergency action plan as an overarching theme, you know.
And I think that emergency response plan feeds in really well to the example that John gave of, you know, let's say it's an owner that's in Florida and doesn't even have a clue what's going on at their dam, and you know, they're not around, they're not reachable. You know, how's that authority, you know, chain go? How does that fall down? Who then gets to make the decision of what happens in their absence? Or if, you know, the owner's just outright negligent, you know, what's the step then, you know, for addressing issues if the owner is either not engaged or unwilling? I think that's what this is getting to, such that, you know, we basically have clear lines of authority and communication, and then ideally, you know, source of funding or access to funding that we can get to quickly, that we don't have to go through and write an emergency order and get it approved and go through the Attorney General's office and, you know, get appropriations, like that we can just actually do something.
If there's an immediate risk, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Just taking a few notes here. So, I mean, based on that, thank you, Luke, for the clarifications, and Dan as well. So even backing up to kind of step one of developing the statewide, clarifying the roles and responsibilities statewide of how things should work, maybe stop there. Is there general agreement that that's worthwhile and something that this group wants to move forward? So a couple heads nod there.
Well, we may need to repackage the scope of the recommendation, because even what Dan just mentioned, that's very far reaching, because it almost gets to like eminent domain, right? At what point does the state intercede, under what circumstances, and take control of the situation and spend whatever money they feel is necessary to protect public health and safety? That's a pretty far reaching thing, right? That's not just a recommendation that it would be highly encouraged that everyone have an emergency response plan. And so I think there's probably a need to either repackage or break this down into things that are doable. Because again, I can quickly jump to that point of qualification and capability of owners underlies a lot of this stuff. And are there certain people in the state that we should not allow to own dams? Now that's a tough one, right? I mean, how are we going to move forward on that? But short of that, I think there's some easier chunks that may be easy to put in place. And then we got to think through, well, if we can't get people to do that when it comes to the use of resources, then obviously we're going to have to think through what do we do then. But if we want to go all the way down to, you've got a failing dam and you need someone to bring some earth movers in and pour emergency, concrete into a spillway to try to stabilize the failure. I mean, that's what a competent owner with resources would already be doing, while they're also notifying Abby that I've got an imminent failure on a dam, so that she can get everybody out of the way and make sure no one dies if the dam does indeed fail. And without that front part, it's not easily solvable in my mind if you include it into this other stuff. So I would almost tier the recommendations, because when you look at things from classic emergency response planning, I mean, there are basic rules and good best practices that all professionals are aware of. And that's kind of what they're saying here. Have a good plan, check it annually, make sure your phone trees are accurate, do your exercises. That's just kind of almost boilerplate emergency planning stuff, which I'm not discounting that. That's good. But then there's this sub-tier more difficult questions on when you don't have somebody that has resources to even write the plan. What do you do? If you're in an emergency and no one's responding or has resources to try to stabilize the structure, can the state intervene and bring resources in to try to prevent the imminent failure? That's almost a whole separate category of who calls that shot and who gets to take control of an asset that the state doesn't own. I'd almost want to separate that out as something that needs to be considered and contemplated, but maybe a bigger issue that beyond what the task force can really, hope to reasonably even propose a resolution method, because it gets into some very, very thorny issues here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we can move forward in that direction. And, there may be a middle ground here of just recommending that more consideration to those topics, John, of when and where and how the state steps in and how that's paid for, that should have more consideration here. I think we are cognizant of time here with 15 minutes left. I don't know that we're going to be able to kind of resolve all those here immediately, but I think we've had good discussion and on this topic here, and we may be able to work individually here with a few members and try to bring something back to the group for its next meeting between the Eagle staff, PSC, and I may call on a couple members individually to run some language by or talk a few more things through, if that sounds good for everybody.
So John, what some of the other subgroups have done?
I'm having a hard time hearing you, Amy.
Oh, really?
That's a little bit better.
Is that better? Okay. So what some of the other subgroups have done is that they have, so for like this one where maybe or at least maybe the first half of the recommendation is good, but it brings up all these other issues, they have basically said, we can adopt that, but then they've made like a footnote in the recommendation part that they want to come back and revisit certain issues. And then they made a little list of what those issues were, because I think the hope is if we can make good progress on the ASDSO recommendations at this meeting, then we can spend more time at the next subgroup meeting talking about other things that ASDSO didn't really address. And then the other thing that the subgroups have been doing is if there's ones that have a lot of either diverse opinions about or ones that need extra work, the task force members have volunteered to take the lead and come back to the next meeting, having worked on it, maybe with other people in the subgroup.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And I think that tracks pretty well with what we're talking about here. I think what we've heard from folks is that there's general agreement that there's room for the state to better clarify the roles and responsibilities among Eagle, local emergency managers, and dam owners. Additional consideration needs to be given to when, where, and how the state may take increasing enforcement actions and how that's paid for. That there would be benefit from additional staff, additional resources, and templates on the development of emergency action plans provided by the state, and potentially requirements for those developments with local municipal and county emergency managers. So I think we've heard the feedback, and I can take some of that and put pen to paper here and try to bring it to a resolution ahead of our next meeting. And then we would use that second meeting to continue talking through the additional recommendations that committee members may have. So if there are folks who would like to volunteer, I was kind of leaning towards Luke and John, since you have a lot of feedback and thoughts here. Are there others who would like to be part of that discussion offline?
I guess I have an alternate proposal, because
okay.
I think we can recommend that that we have a more clearly defined set of expectations of pre-planning activities for emergency response plans. I think that's easy to do. We can probably quickly align on what those should contain. Abby can probably rattle it off the top of her head. But then I think the next recommendation is, rather than try to solve things with this task force, I think the recommendation would be that the state of Michigan host a workshop or series of workshops with emergency planning leadership across the state, maybe associated with the high hazard and safety significant dams, so that they can work through that and provide their input. And really help to have that dialogue that Abby's discussing, where there are known gaps, and there's probably more than just Abby seeing that that would need to be addressed. And that's the recommendation, is to hold a series of workshops with the right stakeholders to sort through all of the various complexities of this question. Because I think that's an achievable ask. I think perhaps Eagle or some state entity can host that workshop with the right stakeholders, so that we don't just think that we know what all the problems are that need to be resolved in this area.
I would second that, and just say that I think that's been some of the recommendations out of the other groups, is we don't need to solve this problem today. We recognize that it needs to be a recommendation that would benefit from a stakeholder group input. So that's the recommendation of the task force, is over the next several months, we convene stakeholder groups and really flesh this issue out, but we recognize it's a need. So I think that's that's what John was just describing, but then that's come up previously as well.
That's fair enough. Are others comfortable with that? Dan, I see you took yourself off mute there.
I did. I guess the only hesitation, I think it's right, and it is sort of the right way to go. I guess my only hesitation with it is, I think this task force, or this group, was formed, following Midland, and I think the recommendations that we come up with are probably going to be the single best opportunity, particularly for legislative action. If these are sort of administrative things and how the SEOC engages or how Eagle engages, that's one thing. But if we're making recommendations, I'm just worried that if the recommendation is that we sort of get a group of people together to sort of have stakeholder discussions to come up with recommendations, it's sort of like, you lose the attention span at some point. And we're already at a point. I mean, this obviously isn't going to happen in lame duck. It's for the next legislature to deal with, some of whom, weren't paying attention to what was going on in Midland or anything else. But I just am concerned that sort of if you get sort of a couple steps away from the event that sort of, brought us all together, it becomes harder to get it across the finish line.
That's very fair. Very fair.
Yeah, hey, this is Lisa, and I'm going to just kind of echo Dan's eloquent comments. I appreciate the inclusion and the desire to kind of make sure that we've got all the different voices at the table and we're expansive. I just don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I do want to make sure that we are able to get some recommendations out there and get moving. So I'm kind of balancing that in my head as well.
Appreciate that.
I think we need legislative action that defines the requirements of ownership of a dam, including financial resources and capabilities to implement.
I strongly agree with that, John.
And that's happening, right? I mean, that's part of one of the other work groups, right?
I hope so, but I think John's point of relying on the emergency fund to sort of
do everything. Oh,
I'm with you.
We lost you
Agreed.
here.
Oh, I said, I'm pretty sure, I'm trying to remember what group was discussing that, because I thought I was involved in one that was. And then also the emergency fund and different ways to fund it is definitely being discussed. I was coming up with different funding ideas. So.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the list of work groups so that I can tell you guys which one it is. But yeah, my understanding is obviously recommendations go back to the full task force, and, we could amplify it by, making a point within our recommendations, or, obviously we can all just underscore it in the full task force conversation. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways to make sure that that priority is amplified.
Absolutely.
There it is in any of the other recommendations. Luke, will you help me? You have them even better
I'm
memorized.
looking, but I'm.
I don't
Yeah,
think
I don't
found
think
it yet.
there is one.
no, but that's one of the
There's
things.
not?
I don't think there's
It's
one
got to though.
that says you should look at dam ownership. That was one of the recommendations, or one of the things I was thinking earlier was that, you know, we're not bound to only the ASDSO recommendations. So, and Dan and I are kind of scrambling. Dan Devon and I are scrambling behind the scenes, like on a separate chat, saying, if it's an emergency, can we go out there and touch the dam? Because I'm not sure we can. You know, so maybe that's an issue that we need to look into. Is we have the ability to do work at a dam, but we have to go through a process of issuing orders and stuff and giving the owner a chance to comply before we have that authority. So that's something that we might suggest internally, is looking at that issue of, if it's a true emergency and you have an unresponsive dam owner, can dam safety staff go out there and touch a dam, you know, to alleviate a danger? I don't know. I don't know that we have that authority.
Okay. Well, I want to be cognizant here of time, and we've got 5 minutes left in our scheduled time together. We do have one more 90-minute meeting. You know, it sounds like there's much that needs to be clarified in terms of this group's recommendations relative to the ASDO recommendations. And we're kind of, as Amy alluded to, overlapping with our discussion for the next meeting with what else do we want to talk about. And I feel like we're already diving in there. So I think what I'd propose to do here is let me summarize the conversation that we've had and recirculate it out. And we'll use that as the basis for our conversation at the next meeting. I think we've unearthed the primary concerns and topics for consideration. And that'll, again, become the basis of the conversation for our next meeting. Does that sound like a good approach? Is everybody comfortable with that approach? So, and I may call on individual members here to clarify your comments here, help me think through a few things, and Luke and Amy and the other Eagle staff, I think we'll probably call on you as well. So if that sounds like a game plan here for everybody, I'm just going to check back on my cheat sheet on the agenda and make sure I'm not missing any additional elements. So, but I believe that's all. Are there any other items here that folks would like to bring up today? Okay, well then, hearing none, I think we'll actually end maybe 2 or 3 minutes early, which is rare. I do just appreciate everybody's time and the discussion that we've had, and look forward to our next meeting and talking in between.
Thank you.